Hi, this is Debbie Cox. I'm one of the professors at Gray School of Theology. I'm also the librarian here. And in this session, I'm going to talk to you about something that is going to help you put your paper together, hold your paper together, and stay on topic. And I call this the Amazing Thesis Sentence Formula. The Amazing Thesis Sentence Formula is a powerful tool for putting together a paper, and it will also help you to structure your outline. The Amazing Thesis Sentence Formula is something that I have worked up over about 32 years of teaching English, and it has helped thousands of my students. I am not exaggerating. Thousands of people have used this Amazing Thesis Sentence Formula and found it to be useful for writing their paper. Now, having said that, I have something to tell you in addition to that, which is if it doesn't work for you, you don't have to use it. This thesis sentence formula has been very helpful to many students, but not everyone works or thinks or creates the same way. Therefore, it is not required that you use the Amazing Thesis Sentence Formula that I've created for your paper, but it will help you so much to get started if you will consider the ideas presented in this session in case you need them at some point. If you can write a brilliant thesis sentence, which is the main idea sentence of your paper, without using this formula, go for it. It certainly won't count off in my class. But many people struggle and struggle and struggle with creating a thesis sentence, and this formula will help you if you are one of those. The following is a thesis sentence formula that has worked in an amazing way for hundreds of my students. Well, now it's thousands because time has passed. Use it if you find that it works for you. Also remember, your thesis sentence should have an edge, something you are providing or proving to the reader with your own thoughts and with the support you find from the Bible and other resources. As I said, a research paper has to make a point, and I discussed in my classes, I have discussed, and in my videos, I have discussed anywhere anyone would listen to me, how important it is that we have a point to make when we write something. We're not just wandering around and rambling on paper. That is fine for writing a letter to your cousin in New Jersey or Alabama, but it's not fine for writing a college-level paper. You have to be doing something with a point. In a thesis sentence, you have to have something you're trying to prove or a statement you're trying to make clear, something you're trying to define for your reader. Two definitions you need to understand what I'm going to talk about. You may already know these, that's fine. A phrase is a group of words. Okay, big deal, a phrase is a group of words. But a phrase is different from a clause. A clause is a group of words containing both a subject and a verb. As I discuss how to create an amazing thesis sentence for your paper, I'm going to use the term phrase and the term clause. And it's helpful if you start with at least a beginning understanding of what those are. About your topic, very important. Start with a topic for which you can take a side or take a stand, and about which you will be able to argue convincingly. This is essential to graduate papers. It's also essential to undergraduate papers. The formula. Write the first phrase or clause. You see why I defined it for you? Write the first phrase or clause. This clause introduces the main topic of the paper you are writing in a way that catches the interest of your reader. A thesis should not be a question. This is a good place to put in the gist or the summary or the essence of your argument. That is, in the first phrase or clause. Now notice that little parenthetical note that says a thesis should not be a question. Many people start writing a paper with a question. For example, when did King David live? Yes, that's a question, but it is not a thesis statement. Even the word statement indicates that it is a sentence, not a question. So what you would do instead of when did King David live, you would do something like, it has been argued that King David lived around the year 500 BC. Now that's a sentence, that's not a question. You can have questions. In fact, questions help you to figure out what your argument is, what your topic is, how you're going to narrow it, but don't put those questions directly into the paper. In the paper, you are telling, you are not asking. So write the first phrase or clause, introduce your major topic of your paper, and try to do it in a way that catches the interest of your reader. So if you can write it in a lively way, a lively fashion, that's fine, but don't make it a question. 2, write the second clause. This clause should definitely contain both a subject and a verb. Up here, you could write a phrase or a clause, depending on what sounded better. But in the second section, I would use a clause. This clause should definitely contain both a subject and a verb, and it describes the way the topic will be limited in this particular paper. If you have not gotten the argument into part 1 above, then this is the place for it. The parallel elements which follow are usually at the end of the second clause. Now let me say just a few more things about this. There's a sentence here that says, it, the clause, describes the way the topic will be limited in this particular paper. It is very, very important to limit your topic. Let me give you an example. Do you want to write a paper on prophecy? All right, there have been multiple encyclopedias of prophecy written. Are you going to write a 24-volume prophecy encyclopedia in 4 weeks, in 8 weeks? I don't think so, and indeed, I wouldn't want you to try. You should go with what the teacher says. If the teacher says 8-page paper, write an 8-page paper on your topic. If the teacher says write a 10-page paper, write a 10-page paper. Some teachers give you a little leeway, some don't. I happen to be one of those teachers who does. However, what you don't want to do is tackle a topic that cannot be addressed in the length of paper you're writing. Have you ever heard that old saying, he tackled a job that couldn't be done and by gosh, he couldn't do it? Well, that's a sort of negative statement, but you don't want to try to do something that's not appropriate to the class. So if you're going to write about prophecy, you're going to have to narrow that down until it will fit into the length paper you're going to write. The same thing, for example, say you want to write about the book of Genesis. You find it fascinating. The book of Genesis is very long, and it covers hundreds, if not thousands of years. So my goodness, what are you going to do? You have to limit the topic. You have to choose, okay, maybe you're going to write about Abraham. You're just going to write about Abraham. There are chapters and chapters and chapters on Abraham. Okay, then maybe you're just going to write about Abraham and Sarah. Okay, you're getting it narrowed down more. Now you're doing a little better. And you narrow a topic until it's appropriate and you have an argument to make. Now, number 3, the parallel elements. See how I hinted at parallel elements in number 2? In number 3, I'm going to clarify what in the world I mean by that. Write parallel or balanced elements, and we're still talking about one sentence. These elements provide specifics on what the paper is going to include and give the reader a sense of what he should expect to read about in this paper. Each of these elements must provide something that supports your argument. There should be at least 2 parallel elements and at the most 5. Parallel elements must be the same part of speech and must be phrased similarly. That has to do with balanced sentence structure and balanced grammatical parts. But let's look at the main part. Let's look at the main concept of parallel elements first. What are parallel elements? They are 3 parts. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. And what are they of your paper, as it turns out? So when you get to the point where you have written a really good, amazing thesis sentence by this formula, you not only have a bit of an introduction in the first phrase or clause, and then you have a clarification of the argument in the second clause, and then you have balanced parallel elements in the third, and the third section will actually be the body of your paper. Paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, or, in some cases in a longer paper, section 1, section 2, section 3. This helps you structure your paper immediately out of the thesis sentence. There's one other thing it does, and this is important too. Have you ever been surfing on the internet? Let's say that you were surfing on the internet and what you were interested in was bicycles. You wanted to find the perfect bicycle to ride in your city or up your mountain or wherever you live. And you wanted to find that perfect bicycle. So you start on a page about bicycles. And then there's this sky blue bicycle that you really like. So you go in and you type in sky blue. And it takes you to a company called Sky Blue that sells computer parts. And you think, well, yeah, I kind of need a new monitor. So you look at the Sky Blue. I made that company up, by the way. You look at the section on monitors and you think, that's very interesting. So then you type in monitor. And then you find all these other companies. And then you type in color monitor and the size you want. And then you have a whole... But what happened to your original topic? You were looking for bicycles. The internet is such a good place to get lost. Well, people get lost in their own papers too because they haven't clarified their topic. So what you want to do is write these balanced elements and then stick to them. Don't write about everything in the world that might have the slightest reference to your topic. Instead, write about the elements that you've chosen. Now, as an example, instead of just talking about what a balanced element is, I want to show you some balanced elements in research papers. Now, I have a really big, thick, fat book here on my desk, and I'm going to show you this book. Oof. This book is The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. Now, if that doesn't look big to you, then your computer monitor's too small. This book is heavy. Now, I could ask you to read all of this big, thick book to learn about writing well and writing sentences, but instead, I'm just going to show you a few great thesis sentences that you could use and that you could write about if you were writing about William Shakespeare. Now, you, on the other hand, are writing about the Holy Bible and topics that have to do with the Holy Bible. And so your topics will not be the same as these William Shakespeare examples I'm giving you. I don't want to write anybody's paper for them. Instead, I'm going to give you something that will parallel very nicely from one of the best human writers. Let's look at example 1. When William Shakespeare moved to the 16th century city of London, he faced a city filled with political rivalry, theater groups at war with each other, and a group of very antagonistic Puritan leaders. You say, I'm not going to write about Shakespeare, Ms. Cox. Why are you talking about this? I'm not talking about Shakespeare. I'm talking about structure of thesis sentences. I'm talking about the way a thesis sentence can be put together. So let's take a look at what the first clause in this sentence is. When William Shakespeare moved to the 16th century city of London. This is a clause because it has both a subject and a verb, and it goes all the way to this comma. That's the entire clause. When William Shakespeare moved to the 16th century of London, that sets my place, my time. It gives me a sense for where the paper is going to be happening. He faced. Although that's very short, it is a clause because it has a subject, he, and we know who he is because it was just mentioned, and faced. So he's facing something. That's the verb. Now here are our parallel elements. A city filled with political rivalry, theater groups at war with each other, and a group of very antagonistic Puritan leaders. In a real sentence, in a real thesis sentence inside your paper, you would not number these parts. I have numbered them in this first example just to show you that there are three and they are parallel parts. Let me say that you have to write a 10-page paper. That's a fairly normal, not even a long college paper, a 10-page paper. And many people have a problem with writing enough. By giving themselves plenty of room inside more than one parallel part, they have the opportunity to write a longer paper. It's encouraging because you know your first section is going to be a little introduction that has to do with these two, and then your third, fourth, and fifth sections are going to be outlined for you, note the word outlined, in your parallel elements. A city filled with political rivalry. London was wild with politics at that time. Theater groups at war with each other. There were theater groups in different parts of the city who really wanted to steal the audiences from all the other theater groups. And three, a group of very antagonistic Puritan leaders. These guys didn't want there to be a theater at all. And they were sometimes picketing the theaters. So here I have three different subjects all about William Shakespeare as he moved into the city of London and what it was like for him. That's what my paper is about. And I'm going to have to prove these points. The reader correctly expects the author of this paper to prove what he says in this thesis is true. You can tell me that, but prove it to me. Tell me the names of these political parties. Tell me what they were angry about and make it relate to Shakespeare. Tell me about the theater groups that were at war. There was the Swan, there was the Globe, there was one that was just called the Theater. There were a lot of them. And a group of very antagonistic Puritan leaders. Now that's the part that interests me because it might relate to my religious beliefs. And I can ask myself, what do I think about theater? And what do I think about whether or not Shakespeare's theater is right or wrong? That might not be the part that interests you. So you would have to prove these things with details, and those details would come from what? From your research. So we have parallel parts, and this would come from research. Here's example 2, and I'm sticking with Shakespeare for all these examples. As an author of popular literature, William Shakespeare intended to entertain his audiences. But sometimes he also taught a moral lesson or implied one, as he did in the plays Romeo and Juliet, The Merchant of Venice, and Measure for Measure. Here's my first phrase, and actually it's a little longer because it's a first phrase plus a clause. As an author of popular literature, William Shakespeare intended to entertain his audiences. So maybe the reader already knew that, perhaps the reader did not know that, but now he's informed of some background information for the paper he's about to read. William Shakespeare intended to entertain his audiences, but sometimes he also taught a moral lesson or implied one. You know, you can teach something just out in your face. You should not lie. Or you can imply something by the story you tell, you know, a story about somebody who told a lie and the consequences. So sometimes he taught a moral lesson or implied one, as he did in the plays, and here are my parallel elements. Notice how short they are. The length of a parallel element doesn't matter, but they should be balanced, so it's better if they are somewhat near the same length. Romeo and Juliet, The Merchant of Venice, and Measure for Measure. Now, what do you think this paper is going to do? Do you think that it is going to talk about Romeo and Juliet, The Merchant of Venice, Measure for Measure, and it's going to specifically talk about them in relationship to teaching a moral lesson or implying one? Now here is example 3. In William Shakespeare's play, Twelfth Night, Duke Orsino is a most immature character, as one can see by carefully examining his relationships with both Viola and Olivia. Now, in this particular sentence, we only have 2 parallel elements. You will notice that they're both women characters, Viola and Olivia. Why would he only put 2 when I've been telling you 3? It's because there's enough material for him to write the entire paper and have it the length the teacher wants and have all the details that he needs with only 2 parallel elements. First phrase, in William Shakespeare's play, Twelfth Night. Well, that's easy. That sets our context for us, doesn't it? William Shakespeare wrote it, and the name of the play is Twelfth Night. The reader's not going to expect to read about Romeo and Juliet or about Macbeth or about Hamlet. He knows from the first phrase exactly what it's going to be about, Twelfth Night. Duke Orsino is an extremely immature character, as one can see by examining his relationships with both. And this says this is actually 2 clauses run together. So you see, the formula doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be exactly like the very first sentence is said in order to be a good thesis sentence. There's room for your creativity. There's room for you to phrase the sentence in a way that works for you. And the parallel elements are just 2 words, Viola, Olivia. But when you've said those 2 words, you've said a lot, because these are 2 women. There will be lots to write about with only 2 parallel elements this time. So what do? We look at this and say, where's the argument? Well, one part of the argument, the main part of the argument, is right here. Duke Orsino is an extremely immature character. Now, some people love Shakespeare so much that they can't see any flaws in his heroes. But in this play, I argue that Duke Orsino is an extremely immature character, and after you've read this play or looked at it again, I think you'll agree with me. He doesn't treat Viola or Olivia very well until almost the end of the play. And here's example 4. Shakespeare's play, Romeo and Juliet, is considered one of the great romantic tragedies of all time, but the tragedy could have been avoided had it not been for a tapestry of human weaknesses, including Romeo's anger, Juliet's immaturity, and Friar Lawrence's scheming. Now many of you have read Romeo and Juliet before or seen it in a movie or a play. This is a wonderful example because it does everything that we want the parallel elements of a sentence to do, and it does everything we want a thesis sentence to do. First, it introduces the context in which we're reading this. Shakespeare's play, Romeo and Juliet. And then it says, is considered one of the greatest romantic tragedies of all times. Well, it is. There's no argument about that really out there. Nobody says it's a comedy. But the tragedy could have been avoided had it not been for a tapestry of human weaknesses. Now there's a little pretty word choice there, but it doesn't really mean too much. It's just these are a bunch of human weaknesses. And I chose to use the word tapestry because I like the way it flowed, and it means things that are interwoven together, including, and here are 3 parallel elements, Romeo's anger, Juliet's immaturity, and Friar Lawrence's scheming. The writer of this paper will prove to me how these character flaws ruin the love story and turn it into a tragedy. Well, most of you are familiar enough with the story of Romeo and Juliet to know that Romeo and Juliet both die. And they die due to mistakes that are made because of human weaknesses. There's not much of redemption or salvation in the play Romeo and Juliet. If we could have had some kind of a religious conversion for them and their families, then that story might have ended quite differently. And that's what we want to say now, is that your paper can actually do any number of possible things, and you can write about anything using this research paper formula. You can write about Shakespeare, you can write about baseball, you can write about the Holy Bible using this. Here's the final example. Although Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare is not by any definition a medieval morality play, it contains a strong warning about the tragedy that can happen in human lives because of the vices of lust, hatred, and vengeance. First clause, although Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare is not by any definition a medieval morality play. Second clause, it contains a strong warning. You see, Shakespeare tended to prove his points by story and by character, not by saying, thou shalt not. Instead, he gave you a story where the main characters die because of their sins and their weaknesses. It contains a strong warning about the tragedy that can happen in human lives because of the vices of lust, hatred, and vengeance. This writer must prove by his thesis, using these resources, which confirm his argument that lust, hatred, and vengeance are vices that can create tragedy in human lives, using examples from Romeo and Juliet and other resources. And those resources would be about Romeo and Juliet. And when you use other resources in a paper about the Bible, then what you're going to do is you are going to choose other resources from writers who have written about the section of the Bible you're writing about. If you're writing about Hebrews, then you're going to find famous authors or Christian authors, or even maybe people from the past, famous preachers from the past, who have talked about the section that you're talking about, and use them as your research, as your resources. Now that you see how it's done, start trying it for yourself. You do not have to get your thesis sentence perfect the first time. Just start using the formula, work on it, and see how it goes. If you need any help, just contact me. I'm Debbie Cox, and I'm here to help you.